Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's Pete Wargent Property Pod. Something a little bit different and exciting this week. We've got Steve Palise from Palise Property, who's an expert in commercial property investing, something that a lot of people don't know much about. So, Steve, welcome to the show. Really excited to have you on and to tap into your key insights.
No, thanks for having me on, Pete. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so we actually caught up in London relatively recently, and it's great to meet you in person. I guess it's been really difficult this past year to actually coordinate meetings with all the travel restrictions going on, but hopefully things getting back to normal. So, yeah, it was excellent to put a name to the face and, just to learn a bit more about commercial property. And I thought, well, what better thing to do than actually put it together into a 30-minute podcast so we can all get access to your key insights. So first off, Steve, tell us a bit about your background and where you grew up. You're a Sydney boy originally?
Yeah, Sydney boy, Western Sydney. So I grew up in a suburb called Wentworthville. So fairly low socioeconomic, but no, it was fine. It was happy childhood, played a lot of football, really good at mathematics. I loved maths. And then that drove me to basically do engineering. So I studied robotic engineering at university and then got a job designing like medical equipment, like robotic limbs and things like that. Hated that. I loved the end product, but I hated the sitting there coding for a year just to be able to do something. Then I switched to mining because that was like a 2-month design process. And then 3 months later, there's an 80-meter machine sitting there. So designed mines for about 7 years. And then in the background, I was growing a residential portfolio and then bit the bullet about 7-8 years ago and became a buyer's agent.
You're known these days for being an expert in the commercial property space in particular. So what was your light bulb moment that got you into commercial property? You mentioned you've got an engineering brain and a head for numbers. Was it largely a financial decision that moved you in that direction?
No, so I actually just fell into it. So I was primarily residential. Like I've got close to 1,000 residential properties under my belt. So I'm well versed there. And then just one day, one client asked me to find him a commercial property. And I was like everyone else. I was against it. I was like, this is high risk, high vacancy. This isn't going to work. You got a high deposit, all that type of nonsense that I hear now. And then literally just started looking at the numbers and went, well, if you buy $1 million property and you're getting $45,000 a year cash flow after all expenses, that's pretty attractive. And then you start looking at other numbers at how quickly you can grow the portfolio, pay it down. That once I actually started looking into it, there are bad commercials, but there's some bloody good ones if you look into it.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? If you know what you're doing, and institutions would look at the commercial properties, particularly those seeking a more attractive yield, because as we know, residential property, particularly in Australia, has low yields. So people are very focused on the capital growth. So there's a few of the myths there about commercial property. Before we go into some of those differences between resi and commercial, when you're talking about commercial property, obviously there's lots of different types of commercial property from offices and retail and sheds and all the rest of it. What type of properties do you most commonly look at when you're actually purchasing commercial?
Yeah, so for me and my clients, we generally focus on industrial. Industrial is just a good one because they're really versatile and you can get some comfort in the numbers because you can look at all the other ones in the complex, what they rent for, what they sold for, how long the vacancy periods are. So you have some good like-for-like comparisons. And then the other one I generally buy is essential retail. So that's like the little suburban strip shops where it's surrounded by residential. There's no future development in terms of competition in the area. So that's like the medical centres, the physios, barbershops, hairdressers, bakeries, just those little strip shops where once it's there. You get the foot traffic and the growth there. I've never really bought offices. For me, it's just too high risk, especially the high density stuff. It's like buying a off the plan high density apartment, for instance, where it's just too risky for oversupply. They can build a 20-story skyscraper next to you, and all of a sudden you're going to have 1,000 stock on the market. So for me, you still need to buy to the fundamentals. So good land component, good population growth, low vacancy, good infrastructure spending in the area. So you still focus on those residential fundamentals, but then you also need to look at the commercial fundamentals.
Sounds like you've made a smart move there, because at the moment, there's a lot of disruption happening in the office space. I think on average, probably a lot of firms need less office space per employee at the moment because of the shift caused by the pandemic. But actually, I think a lot of that may stick, a lot more sort of flexible working arrangements, working from home, people commuting from lifestyle locations, maybe a couple of days a week. So there's a lot of uncertainties in the office space at the moment. Industrial property demand, though, seems to have been particularly strong and consistent throughout. So I think, as you said, maybe more predictable, steadier returns, I guess, for investors, but the office environment looks particularly unclear at the moment. So let's cover off some of the myths about commercial property investing, because I guess, people often say, oh, yeah, but you need a big deposit and you get long vacancy periods and the capital growth might not be as good. And there's a lot of things that which might be true potentially on average, or they might have an element of truth in them. But obviously, commercial property is a big asset class and it needn't necessarily apply. So talk to us first about the types of deposit that your clients would typically need to purchase a commercial property.
So generally, you'll need a 30% deposit. It can be up to 35%. However, there are a few lenders at the moment doing 20% deposits. So ANZ at the moment are doing a 30-year P&I loan on a 2.6% interest rate. So still really strong deals out there. In terms of the interest rate as well, you'll generally pay 0.2 to 0.6% more, but the cash flow difference just absorbs that very quickly. But just generally, you will need a slightly bigger deposit. You're not going to be able to get a 90% loan with lender's mortgage insurance and things like that. So absolute minimum is a 20% deposit.
Yes, and you mentioned there the cash flow. So obviously this is a big draw card for a lot of people looking at commercial property. Now, in the residential space for a house in Melbourne, the yield might be, who knows, 2.5%. There's obviously a lot of different types of residential property and locations. In other parts of the country, you might get, say, 4% or maybe even 5%, depending on where you're looking. But typically, I guess, if you're looking at sort of between 3 to 4% yield on residential properties, seems to be quite common in the current environment anyway. But obviously, in commercial property, there's probably a bigger range. What kind of yields would you say is typical for a commercial property investment?
Yeah, that's fine. So one point to note, Pete, is people will try to compare residential yields with commercial, but they need to realise they're actually talking gross yields. So when they're saying 2.5 to 4%, that's actually gross. So you're paying the outgoings, your council rates, your water rates, your maintenance on the property. Commercial, you don't have those outgoings. The tenant pays it. So when I talk like a 4, 5, 6, 7% yield, that's a net yield. So it's actually equivalent to about a 10 to 12% gross residential yield. It's going to vary, but most of the things I'm buying. So for Melbourne, for instance, I bought one last week at a 5.8% net yield. But on average, Sydney, Melbourne, you're probably looking at between 4.5% and 5% net yields. If you go, say, Brisbane and Perth, 5.5 to 6. And then if you go regional, like a Townsville, you'll get a 7% net yield. However, that's going to have a high vacancy period. So it's about balancing the risk versus reward with commercial.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
Just like in every asset class, I guess, sometimes the higher yield might reflect a risk of some sort or other. And as you mentioned, sometimes if the yields are very high in commercial, that might reflect a higher risk of vacancy or another risk, potentially lack of price growth or whatever it may be. So obviously vacancy risk is one of the things that people worry about with commercial. I mean, it's a risk in residential property as well, of course. But you tend to find with residential property, well, if you drop the rent $10 a week, you'll get a tenant sooner or later, even when there's high levels of vacancy, relatively speaking. But what about commercial property and industrial units? I guess, do you have longer vacancy period risk there?
Yep. So it's going to be case by case, and it depends what and where you buy. Vacancy rates in most capital cities for industrial are actually quite low. They're generally between 1.2 and 2.2%. That generally translates to, if you lose your tenant, you're going to lose them for 3 to 9 months. So you're looking kind of around that 6-month mark for vacancy, which scares off a lot of residential investors. They think, oh no, I've got 6 months of no tenant. The property is actually still cash flow positive for that year. It's just not, if you're buying $1 million one, it's not 45 grand a year positive, it's 15 grand for that year. The other thing as well is they're really versatile spaces. So it can have any types of tenant, but when you do lose the tenant, it feels longer than it actually is. So with residential, you might lose your tenant 1 or 2 weeks every couple of years. And then over 10 years, that's actually 3-4 months. Whereas with commercial, you have the same tenant for 10 years, but then you'll have 6 months worth of vacancy. So you feel it in one hit. So you do need to prepare for that. But in terms of the actual differences, it's not that far. And if you've got $1 million property and it's giving you 45 grand a year cash flow, in 10 years' time, that's 450 grand theoretically you've got sitting there, as comparing it to a neutrally geared residential property. So you can mitigate the risk. People just kind of doomsdays and they focus all on the negatives and not the positives.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I suppose that applies across all asset classes. I think, as you say, you would need to plan ahead and cater for a potential vacancy, but that applies in residential property too. And in fact, sometimes with Resi, you get a vacancy and you need to do some kind of a cosmetic renovation or upgrade or facelift just to get the place tenanted again. And then, you add up the cost of that, and it can be equally punishing.
If you get residential wrong, as long as you've bought in a generally okay area, you might have a few weeks vacancy here and there and it'll be a little bit tough time. The difference with commercial is if you don't know what you're doing, you can really burn yourself. Like if you went out and bought in a regional town, an industrial warehouse, and the vacancy rates are really large, because it's not as easy as residential. You just go on a website and look at vacancy rates. Those numbers don't exist. You have to manually kind of do the work. You could have a property sitting there vacant for years. So it'd be like if you bought in a mining town and the mine closed, that property is an absolute dud. But similar to residential, you go buy in a mining town and the mine closes, you're going to have paid too much for an asset. Retail is a bit of a funny one as well, because buying one street back from the main strip is a completely different asset to the main street, whereas residential, that doesn't so much happen. So you can burn yourself. You just need to really crunch the numbers and know what you're doing, and then you can reduce most of the risk.
Yes, and I guess that's where using an expert such as yourself really comes into its own. I think with residential property, one of the reasons that it's so popular, I think, for mum and dad landlords is that people feel intuitively that they understand the asset class, because I guess even by virtue of being a renter or buying your first home, everybody's got some exposure to the residential market, and an awful lot of it, of course, is common sense. Now, where are people moving to? Where are the key school zones, amenities? With commercial, as you mentioned, you've got to think a little bit more broadly about diversified industries and buying the right type of property for the location. Now, on that point, in the residential property space, there's a lot of talk about buying in landlocked suburbs where the supply is somewhat limited, and you've got potentially higher capital growth locations where the yields might be lower. Typically, people talk about the blue chip suburbs in the big capital cities and so on. Now, in commercial property, obviously, you've got different types of commercial property and a very broad range of potential locations that you could buy into. So what do you think about when you're looking for a location to buy an industrial property?
Yeah, so I think this is a really hard question, because it is going to be case by case. So different, like say we're going industrial, different locations are going to service different types of regions. So like the ones that you mentioned where it's surrounded by residential properties, they're generally service-based businesses. So they're going to be the mechanics and the spray painters and the kitchen fabricators, and they're generally going to service that residential area. There's also going to be a lack of supply there. So you should get some good rental increases. And assuming that that population is growing in that suburb, so they're building townhouses and units and the population is growing there, that can be a really solid investment. The negative with buying generally in an established area is you're probably not going to get the same yield as buying something on the outskirts of a city. So you might buy a 4.5% in the middle of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, whereas if you move out to 30 kilometres out, you can start looking at 6.5%. So the one on the outskirt can stay at the same price, and just with the cash flow, the one on the inside of the city actually has to grow 30% more just to remain on par with it. So it's all about balancing that risk of vacancy with the capital growth, with the rental increases versus how stable the tenant is. Sometimes those outside regions are actually quite strong because that's where they put the infrastructure. So if they're building roads, apartments, new infrastructure facilities, guess what they need? They need warehouses. Like a lot of people will tell me like, oh no, I don't like commercial. Residentials are fundamental for life. People need a roof over their heads. And then I'll always cheekily respond with, where do they think the roof came from? Like everything you touch in your life has generally been through 5 to 10 warehouses minimum before it even gets to you. So you need warehouses. It's just the fact that you need space, fabrication, storage, distribution. There's a lot of uses to it. So for me, it's just as critical for life as a residential property.
Yes, I've seen some of those similar dynamics in farmland, which I do know a bit about as somebody who's invested in farmland. And I think sometimes if you're buying on the edge of a town or a city or a village or whatever, there is sometimes a hope value priced into the land because there's the potential for future development away from being cropland potentially towards residential or other uses. And as you say, it's often about balancing up the growth potential with the yield and so on. And I think, as you've touched on previously, people say residential capital growth is higher, which may be true depending on the location and property type. But if that was the case across the board, then wouldn't you be able simply to buy commercial properties very cheaply? And of course, in many cases, that's just not the case. And I suppose that in itself tells its own story that if you buy well, the capital growth on commercial can be very attractive as well. So a couple of other potential differences that spring to mind. The financing is going to be different, I think, for commercial. So do you pay different interest rates typically on a commercial property? And also, depending on the age and style of the building, potentially more depreciation for investors in commercial as well?
Yep. So for first point with lending, yeah, it is a slightly different space. And there's also more options for lending as well. So not only do you just get the 30-year loans, you can go 15, 20, 25, 30-year principal and interest only. But then there's also loans called lease stock loans where they give you a loan primarily based on the length of the lease and the strength of the tenant. So they're quite good options. If you're at your serviceability limit for residential, you can then still keep buying properties in the commercial space because you can get lease stock loans. Then there's commercial only lenders, and then there's no doc loans. So if you want to be chatting to someone who's kind of well-versed in the commercial space, if you are going there. And then what you alluded to before, the interest rates are slightly higher. So not too much. It used to be quite a lot. It used to be 1 to 2%. Now we're talking 0.2 to 0.6% generally on average. But you can still get there.
The other point was just on depreciation, because I guess when you're investing in a larger commercial style of property, there's potentially going to be higher depreciation, I assume, depending on the construction and the fit out.
Yeah, that's generally the case. It's just normally because building a commercial is more expensive than building a residential one. Like concrete's going to depreciate more than obviously a timber frame house. So similar rules apply. You still get the 30 years on the structure, etc., but they normally have a bigger build cost. But again, it's case by case. If you buy a tin shed warehouse, that's completely different to a concrete tilt-up panel warehouse. And then you can even buy stuff like you might buy a medical centre that's actually a residential property, bare bones, but it's now a medical centre. That's going to have the same depreciation as a residential property. It just depends where you buy. The numbers get skewed a lot because people try to make these general statements, but it just depends what you're buying. If an industrial is completely different to a body corporate retail, which is completely different to an office space. So it's just same thing with everything else. You go get a depreciation schedule. You look at the cost of the build, the cost of replacement, the fit out costs, the plant and equipment, and you basically get a depreciation from that. But to answer your question, yeah, you do generally get at least a few grand higher in that kind of $1 million range than a residential property.
Yeah, so I guess a key point or takeaway there is that while there might be a lot of general statements made about commercial property, actually largely comes down to looking at it on a case by case and an investment by investment basis. So I guess if you're weighing up whether to choose residential property or commercial, you basically got to factor in your own situation, and particularly from what you're saying, the amount of deposit that you've got, whether you're targeting the higher cash flow or passive income, what kind of capital growth you might need or expect, and then also your appetite for vacancy periods and the potential for managing that, and then the other bits and pieces, as you mentioned, on the mortgage rates and depreciation. I guess they're just the icing on the cake rather than the key part of the decision. What do you think if somebody said to you, which is better, residential or commercial property investing? Do you favour commercial over resi, or do you think it's more of a case-by-case thing?
It is a case-by-case. I obviously do favour commercial. Like for like, if you've got the same loan, the same interest rate, and you're comparing a residential with a commercial is a much better performer because you get a really high cash flow. And as we kind of alluded to before, you actually get the same capital growth. So if you buy right, you're going to have this asset that pays itself off in 10 years, gives you a passive income, and doubles in value at the same rate as a residential. So you actually do get a much bigger return. But as we kind of said, you need to assess your risk profile versus why you're buying that property, over what time frame, and what you're trying to achieve. Like a commercial will get you basically a passive income much quicker than a residential property. So it might be right for a 60-year-old who's about to retire, or someone who just wants a 20, 30 grand passive income because they want to step away from work. Whereas like a young investor who's starting out their journey, I'm going to tell them, don't buy commercial, maximize your leveraging. Go get the 90 and 80% loans as long as you can until you hit your serviceability limit, because I'd much rather have a portfolio that's 3 times the size than a nice little 20, 30 grand passive income now.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's very, very sound advice, I guess. And weighing in to your personal situation and goals is probably absolutely the key here. Now, you mentioned just before the potential to generate quite substantial excess rent, covering all of the costs and the financing and everything else, to actually have passive income on top of everything else, and the potential, therefore, to generate financial freedom through commercial property. Now, I've seen you say elsewhere that potentially you can use those higher rents or higher yields to actually pay off a commercial property in a decade. Tell us a bit about that potential strategy and how it might all work.
So that's just a risk-reducing strategy. So say you would just want to buy one property. Say you're 10 years away from retirement. You want to go out and buy $1 million property on a 70% loan. That's going to be a $700,000 debt. And then that property is generally going to be between 40 and 50 grand passive income. If you put that 40, 50 grand back into that debt, you can just see it goes from 700 to 650. And then what happens is when you start paying down the debt, your cash flow goes up as well because you've got less interest repayments. And then you start paying it off quicker. So within 10, 11 years, you actually remain debt-free. So then you're at the end of that period with rental increases, you'll probably end up with a $70,000, $80,000 passive income. And that's just buying $1 million asset. Like if you can find me a residential property for $1 million that is going to give you debt-free and 70 grand passive income for the rest of your life, I'm all ears. But for me, that's the game changer with commercial.
Yes, I'd be quite worried if somebody did claim that. I mean, I've seen very high yield residential properties in the past, usually in one industry towns, or certainly in the UK, which I know you're also familiar with. Sometimes you get these sort of very high yield properties where they're rented out by the room and so on. But it tends to, in residential anyway, the very high yields tend to represent either a lot of headaches or a lot of risk, and usually a combination of the two. It's not always a path for everybody, whereas commercial, the higher yields can be very attractive, particularly, as you said, if you structure it right and actually either you can generate passive income from the rent or actually pay down the property, which is particularly an attractive way to go because you can have an unencumbered asset at the end of the process and potentially in a relatively short space of time as well. Now, Steve, you're known as the guy who has literally written the book on commercial property investing. So tell us a bit about the book. And I know that it's actually, well, something we have in common. We actually write our own books rather than getting them ghost written. So we must be in the minority these days. But tell us a bit about the book and where people can track down a copy.
Yep. So just feel free to stalk me on social media. I'm all over the place on Facebook and LinkedIn and things like that. Or you can go to my website, www.paliseproperty.com. I'm happy to give you a free copy of the book as well. Just use the code word free book. But yeah, it's basically 300 pages of textbook type nature of everything you need to know about commercial.
Fabulous. And you also mentioned your business there. Where can people go if they want to actually track you down face-to-face as well?
Yep. So just www.paliseproperty.com. But just shoot me a text, email, social media message, and I'll get back to you within a day and we'll organise a strategy chat and we can go from there.
Fabulous. And just in terms of the due diligence when you're buying a commercial property. So when we buy residential, we normally have, it's just very much a set checklist, but it's largely the due diligence. Much of it is about the inspection and the building and pest reports and negotiation based on comparable residential properties. I'm sensing that for commercial property, it's more of a numbers-driven exercise. So tell us a bit about the due diligence you do on a commercial property. Is it largely based around the numbers and vacancies and comparable industrial properties in the area?
Yes. So this is the main difference with commercial. It's you can't just blag an easy property. You have to do quite a lot of work. So that's looking at the location. So obviously like population growth, infrastructure spending, foot traffic, road traffic, what areas is that servicing? And then once you've found that location, looking at comparable sales, even vacancy rates in the region is a bit tougher. You can't go to a website. You need to look at all the other comparables you can find. And sometimes that's difficult. Like if you're buying a medical center, there's not going to be 1,000 comparables. There's going to be 2 or 3 and you're going to need to look at that. So that one's a bit more of a thumb suck. Then you need to do business analysis. So look at the type of business that's in those premises. Are they longevity? Do they have some longevity? Who's their competition in the area? Are they expanding, growing? How many locations do they have? Then you do contract review, lease review, body corporate reviews, building and pest inspections, comparing rentals, so square meter rates, and then checking things like mezzanine areas and dedicated areas for the site, building approvals, service contracts. I can chat for hours on this, Pete. There's probably about 20, 30 hours of due diligence you should be doing on a commercial property. If your listeners are interested, well, just go on my website. I've got like a free resource section. I've actually got my due diligence checklist on there. There's about 100 items you can go through and check off one by one.
Fantastic. So brilliant summary. Thank you, Steve. And obviously, as you pointed out, there can be risk in any type of investing. But if you do the due diligence right, you do your research, then commercial can give investors the potential for instant passive income and potentially financial freedom. You just got to make sure you know what you're doing, get the right advisors, do the due diligence, and make sure you cover off on those specific risks. So as you said, Steve, you could probably talk all day about commercial, but if people want to know more, probably the easiest thing to do is grab a copy of the book and it's all laid out for them in black and white there. So thanks so much for coming on today, Steve, and it's been a real pleasure to get all of your insights there into the right types of commercial for people to look at, and look forward to catching up with you again in due course.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Pete. It's been good.
Pleasure. Thanks, Steve. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.